right. Hey, everyone, this is Innovators Mindset with Karen Vaites. There you go. That's way better than what I had first. Okay, I could have talked to Karen. We talked for like an hour before this podcast. She is one of my favorite accounts to follow on social media, talking about literacy. As someone who's really focused on innovation, I am really adamant the importance of like reading and writing, how our kids have to really get this down. And there's no better voice for this than you. And I am like so excited. I'm so excited just talking to you, but to share, your insights, your wisdom with my audience. So thanks so much for taking time to be on the podcast, Karen. If you could just kind of introduce yourself, what you do today, how you got there, I think it's a really great place to start.
Thank you so much for having me. And this is a perfect time to be talking about innovation and connecting it to literacy because we have some innovators in our midst. And I hope today we'll get to talk about some of the folks that are showing us how it's done because I couldn't agree more. Foundations are everything.
Absolutely.
Foundations, math foundations. So if we can get that right, we enable so much more creative teaching and learning as kids go up through the grades. But all of that said, so I'm Karen Vaites. I spend too much time in social media doing various forms of advocacy and informational work, trying to get the word out about learning sciences and the science of reading in the science of reading moment. But when we were catching up earlier, which was awesome, it's been a pleasure getting to know you better. Just even before we hopped on, you asked me, so wait, like you're not actually a teacher, and I get that a lot because I talk so much about really deep in the weeds things like my favorite instructional routines and things like that that people sometimes don't even realize that I'm not actually a former teacher. I was raised by an educator. Education's my family business. So my mom was a life career educator who recently retired. And she spent most of her career as a principal and lots of her career as a district leader running professional development or curriculum. She raised, I have a sister who was a speech pathologist working in schools and another sister who's still a teacher. So I actually started my career in business and was in online travel during the dot-com boom days and was managing this booming business for Expedia in London, and it should have been my dream job. But something was missing, and the something for me was the feeling that I was creating good in the world. I had that need that I think a lot of educators have to feel like I go into the world and I make a difference on any given day, and I wasn't getting that in my work before. And I fell accidentally into education just as the Common Core was hitting. So I actually fell in, my first role was working at Student Achievement Partners, which was the nonprofit that was founded by the Common Core authors to help American educators understand these new standards. And I was there to rebuild their website and help with communications work because with my background, that's all I could have done at that point. But in order to do that work at all, to understand the standards, you had to drink from a fire hose about the research behind the standards. So I was there in order to help explain the standards to educators on this sort of hyper fast learning curve to understand this research base. And, what was the research behind how kids learn to read? What was the key research around the math standards and why they'd come to be? And I'll never forget, I'd been at that job about a year. And one of the lead authors of the on the ELA, one of the lead authors of the ELA curriculum was talking to me about something that related to research. And I was like, well, most teachers probably know such and such, and she said, Karen, you don't understand. Like, you've come to sort of figure out that most American universities aren't teaching this stuff to teachers. Like, teacher preparation doesn't really focus on how the brain learns to read, how math, how learning happens, how the brain retains information. That's not what universities are doing. So Karen, by doing this job for a year, you know more about reading research than probably 95% of teachers. And I almost fell off my chair at the time.
Hmm.
I didn't even believe it. I probably didn't believe it for another decade, and I'll tell you how I came to believe it. But it was striking to me that she said it, and that comment never left me. So I went on, and then the sort of decade since, I've spent a bunch of years, about 6 years, as a chief marketing officer, one ed tech company, one curriculum company. I then went on and I've spent the last 5 or 6 years doing consulting work with different organizations that are trying to help raise awareness of different science of reading topics. Um, but it wasn't until Emily Hanford's Hard Words came out and teachers around the country were hopping into Twitter and saying, like, I never knew any of this. No one ever told me this. I can't believe I didn't know this. I feel guilty that I didn't know this. It was really the science of reading movement and all these teachers validating what I'd heard way back when, that like we don't give teachers enough of this information to be successful, that has led me to this journey of, kind of doing whatever I can most effectively do at any given time to help teachers find their way to information to be more successful.
And for me, I think this is a really important thing for everyone to hear. It's never been about whether you taught or not for me, because I don't ever see you saying you need to teach this way. You don't actually do that. What you do is you shine a spotlight on here's what's working and here's why. And that's what I really appreciate. Is like you're trying to illuminate, as you said, that light to like, hey, what do we know works? What do we really connect with? And I think it's always been for me that as much as I talk about innovation, I really know literacy really matters to this. That Yang Zhao said this years ago. He said reading and writing should be the floor, not the ceiling. And my focus is on a lot of times like what is the ceiling, but I also understand how important it is to have that floor. And we were talking about this before, and I'd love your insights on this. A book I read called The AI Driven Leader by Jeff Woods, which is really fascinating to me because it's all about artificial intelligence. How do you lead in a time of all these things that are accessible to us, that people are being manipulated, whatever. The big takeaway was he talked about, he worked with organizations and he said like, hey, if I could do one thing in this organization to improve, what would that be? And so he would help organizations find this. I'm like, for schools, it's got to be reading and writing. Like, and it's like I know it sounds weird. A lot of schools, they don't necessarily have that in their plans, right? Like it's something else, but it's like, hey, you really got to get this part down. So I'm like curious your thoughts on that. And what you're seeing on that, how that leads to other things, and what your viewpoint on that idea is.
No, I think you're very right in an awful lot of ways and places. I try to ground myself in working a lot with educators. Part of the reason that I have an active Twitter feed and I can spend lots of time sharing these stories is like I don't have to be in a classroom all day or at a school building. Educators have really hard jobs, and so I often say, my best work is finding the time and energy to spotlight someone else's best work and make sure that those stories of effectiveness actually make it into social media or a blog or a podcast like yours. So I will say I hear a lot of things out there in my work with educators across the country. I do think that an awful lot of schools focus too little on the fundamentals. We have a cultural issue where we are really set up to keep passing kids along through grades, and that hold up, stop. Are they reading proficiently by third grade no matter what? And what are the consequences for a child if we pass them on and they haven't? There's a lot of magical thinking that like, well, the so and so is not ready, so we'll keep passing them on. But like, no one's waiting in the ninth grade to catch up that second grade reader who's still reading at a kindergarten level. Like if we keep passing them on and they're behind, the system, it gets harder to do that catch up work the further a child gets into their education. And the same is true in math. So one of the paradigms that I think we don't talk enough about is this continuum between the novice learner and the expert learner. And how do we make sure that we take that novice learner, and we've got to get every kid to math fact fluency before we pass them on. We've got to get every kid to third grade reading proficiency as a really solid standard for, if you don't have it, you're going to struggle in middle school and high school. So let's absolutely bake those fundamentals. And then we're giving our fifth and seventh and ninth grade teachers the gift of kids who can be more facile and ready for whatever project-based or creative types of learning we throw at them.
Well, there's actually there's a book I really enjoyed. It's called It's called Hidden Potential by Adam Grant, and it's all about. And I really like it because he says a lot of things I've been saying for a long time. So I feel like whatever. Anyways, but I was like, yeah, I resonate with this because like and maybe it's one of those books that really affirms some of my thoughts. But there is one thing that he shares in it, and I pulled up the quote just because you sparked it in my mind. It said, "Basic literacy makes it possible to leverage character skills more effectively, to be proactive in learning more and learning faster. Prosperity rises as people become more capable of absorbing new ideas and filtering out old ones." He was like basically saying like one of the number one factors for success is actually the ability to be literate, to actually have to read and write, and that's something that really matters to me. And those fundamental skills are crucial. I'm wondering your thoughts on this. I was at a conference last year, and I've written about this before, and it's a tech conference. And one of the things one of the speakers said as I'm sitting there is like, we need to de-emphasize memorization. And you're like, yay! And I was like, oh, no, this is such like you're ostracizing so many people through this. And I'm not saying like you have to memorize everything. You know, there's actually saw something about like people like, hey, remember when we used to like print out MapQuest and travel like pirates? Like
Oh, totally.
Google Maps is like my favorite thing ever. You know, and I understand that, but I couldn't find my way before. It's not like all of a sudden I don't know how to get places. I didn't know how to get to places before Google Maps has enabled that. So I really focused on like, hey, if you really hammer down deep learning by default, you'll memorize it because I want to pull people together. So like when you hear stuff like de-emphasizing memorization, is this connected to some of the things that you're talking about? Because I think there's, you know, there
This is
is some like
completely connected.
I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
Completely connected. So I'm going to take a literacy lens on this, but we could also have the math conversation. Um, one of the one of the troubling things that's happened in American education in the last probably 15 years is I feel like we have a little bit of a cult of kids can just Google it,
Right.
and a de-emphasis on actually learning some of those fact fundamentals. And often in literacy, the conversation focuses on the foundational skills we need to give kids because the ability to decode words is just a foundational skill. And if we can get kids to have that skill to a level of automaticity where I see a new word and if I see the word paraphrase, I can just immediately parse the paraphrase. Like I know the word phrase, I can take that new word on with such ease and facility that it's just it's automated and I can dedicate the bulk of my working memory at that moment not to sitting there and breaking down the word but actually to working on comprehending the broader meaning of what I'm reading in the paragraph in which that word's situated. So usually we talk about foundational skills and we got to build those, but I'm going to put that aside. We can come back to foundational skills because they're key and this is the science of reading moment. There's this other aspect of literacy that no one talks about, or one corner of educators talks about, but we don't have every educator talking about. And that is the role of your knowledge in your reading comprehension. And I should have brought this passage, there are a couple of passages I can pull up on the screen about different topics, that if I asked you to read a passage about cricket, for example, and you were sitting there reading this sentence about rounders and such, frankly, I don't even have the domain vocabulary to approximate the passage. You're not going to make heads or tails of it because you don't know the game of cricket, I'm betting. And similarly, if I put up a passage in 2018 about social distancing, that passage could have had really simple sentence syntax. It, could have been really basic, straightforward descriptions, no fancy language. But if you read that passage and then I said to you, hey, think critically for me about social distancing, you would probably have had no idea how to think critically about that passage unless you were an epidemiologist.
Mm-hmm.
Now, by 2021, we'd all encountered the concept of social distancing and why it may or may not be useful. And at that point, you and I could have really thrown down about whether that passage's recommendation for 6-foot distancing was reasonable, unreasonable, informed, because you had a domain knowledge and you had the vocabulary at that point. So what we know about the world directly influences our ability to think critically about any topic and to comprehend a passage that we read about that topic. But we're in this era of kids can just Google it. So we increasingly de-emphasize learning about the sciences and history foundations? Do kids really need to memorize geography? And then kids get to a state test and they read a passage about, something related to democracy, and they bomb the passage. Well, to what degree did they bomb the passage because there's a reading skill issue? And to what degree did they struggle with the passage because they don't know enough about democracies to really sit there understanding this passage about a democratic principle? This conversation, this topic of, yes, we have to teach kids enough foundations in the science, history, the arts, geography, that they then can go on and have like knowledge is like Velcro. They can then add additional knowledge on because we gave them some foundational knowledge in those topics. That's at the heart of both literacy challenges and also how we get American schooling right, because I want critical thinking as badly as anyone wants critical thinking. I just think we need to apply the learning sciences to this question about how we get there.
As I'm listening to you, I'm thinking about a little bit my own journey as a principal and some of the things that I have developed. I know this is going to sound weird. My friends who grew up with me, they're like, when did you become smart? Like, when did that happen? Because they didn't see a lot of the stuff that I talk about today as something I would ever have conversations about. And it was really when I became a principal, we wanted to do digital portfolios with our students. And it was like, you could see people were doing digital portfolios with things like Google Sites. And they just have kids put links and stuff like that there. I was really adamant that any portfolio a kid would create had to have a blogging component through the writing process. And so that was like, I didn't really understand it. So I started doing it myself. And, 15 years later, I still have that same portfolio I started as a principal. So I'm listening to you talk, something sparks in my mind that I've already read about, have that understanding. I Google my own work to find it so I can find the passage, but I know it so well because I had a time to kind of decipher it, go through the information. And that was like something really important to me as a principal when we were doing this, when parents would say, kids aren't writing the same way they have been. I'm like, actually, they're writing more now because they're actually writing in their blogs, but then they're learning how to comment to other kids. They're reading and they're learning how to respond to each other through the process. I'm like, did you mean cursive or did you mean writing? Because they're writing way more than ever. It might look a little bit different. So like, where do you see because I'll tell you that has changed things for me significantly, because I don't talk about things until I write about them. And that is really, because it's like, I'm also trying to understand, where are you going to push back? Where is the challenge? So it's kind of maybe more empathetic through the process. Like, I want to address the argument before it's in the comments. Do you know what I mean? Like, that's something I think about. So where do you see kind of like technology can help with some of that stuff to really found, not like an either or, but are they connect? Is there a way they can connect in the way that I shared or different ways?
I love this question. It's funny. I've been debating with some of the folks that I do work with about whether or not we need to create a literacy-oriented podcast. And I was just having that conversation this morning.
Yeah.
And part of the argument for it is that digital media is changing the way people consume. So if I used to use my old dusty old WordPress blog and now I use my Substack as ways of getting the word out about things, am I missing part of the audience? That was a little bit of the question, but for me, I'm the same. I need to work my thinking out in writing. And in fact, I often find myself working something out. Like, I'll write the beginning of a Twitter thread and then I'll write more of a Twitter thread and I'll be like, this is something I should think more about. And I transfer it to a blog and then I really refine my thinking there. So I'm the same way in terms of, I think many of us underappreciate how much writing is actually just thinking made manifest. And you really only know something when you've had a chance to like work it out with yourself in your head on paper. But this question of like technology, if I'm being totally honest, and I don't talk about this as much in social media, but I think the next wave of discussion in K-12 will center around, did we go overboard on technology? And where do we have to rein it in versus where is it genuinely an accelerant? Because I came into education, you just heard my story. I came in during the Common Core era, and I thought everybody's going to be flocking to curriculum conferences, and we're going to be talking about like how people get the standards right. I knew nothing about education. And if I oversimplify what I saw over the last decade plus, you could go to the ISTE conference, which I did multiple years, particularly when I was in ed tech. And that's the biggest conference in education still, right? Like tech and education blew up. Nobody really had to push it in. It or was it organically embraced. I traveled schools with the Digital Promise conference and went into classrooms and saw some of the early pioneering innovators. But we don't have a lot of evidence that reading and math outcomes went up as a country during the great era of ed tech. So the hard question for us now is, okay, how do we backtrack and have this science of reading,
Hmm.
and there's a burgeoning science of math movement to say, let's absolutely make sure kids get those fundamentals. And we could have certain conversations about where tech can be an accelerant for those early grades. But for the most part, the short answer is a lot of the early grades, that's the human stuff. That is really well systematized foundational skills instruction. That's picking a curriculum where you're starting to give kids that academic vocabulary and domain knowledge in key areas from kindergarten. Like we're starting to talk about science and history, K5. It's giving kids, and math too, math foundations, everybody gets math fact fluency. It's in the late, and writing fundamentals, like teaching kids sentence structure, giving kids a sense of, like, kids don't just show up knowing how to write a sentence and what a dependent clause is and an independent clause. So giving kids just enough foundation that they will absolutely soar by the technology. And I love the ways, like you say, that in those later grades, once you've got the foundations down,
Mhm.
the ability to dive into the technology and be accelerated in your ability to do research, for example, in a topic that you already have some baseline knowledge in, that's empowerment. But starting a second grader with, hey, here's ChatGPT, get in there and do some
Right.
research, the world will be your oyster. How will you ever know if the response in
Right.
ChatGPT or Google is any good if you had no domain knowledge?
Yeah, there's actually, I was telling you before we had moved to the US, and an example I use often is when we move from Canada to US, the tax structure is different here, right? How you
Yeah,
pay taxes, whatever. Also, you're investing. So in Canada, this is like really in the weeds here. There's what's called RSPs, TFSAs, and there's like I think there's like a first homeowner account. Here, there's 401ks, traditional IRAs, Roth IRAs. There's ones you can use
yeah.
if you're self-employed. There's ones you can't use if you're self-employed, right? It's very confusing. And a lot of people listening to me are like, what is this? Why is this guy bringing this up? So I actually said, hey, I've moved to the US. I want to understand what are some of the best tax incentivized strategies to actually help me invest. And it basically said, here's a plan, here's a process.
Sure.
But as you were sharing, I had to like understand some stuff to know, is this valid? Or like, hey, I don't understand this. Where do I dig in a little bit more, as opposed to just like, I'm just going to do what it tells me, right? And then also verifying with an accountant, like, hey, here's something that I've kind of go through this process. But if I didn't have that fundamental understanding in the first place, that information, I could have asked the question, but it's like it still wouldn't make any sense to me. So I think that is a really crucial component of what you're talking about, because someone was saying, I was watching them, of course, on Instagram. Employers are looking for people that are like can leverage AI. That's like their number one skill. I'm like, no, they want you to be able to read and write. They actually want you to know how to be able to think, right? So like, they're not just like use AI for everything, because you know what? If all you're doing it, AI will figure out how to do that for you.
You know what the number one skill is with AI? The ability to write a good, precise prompt.
Hmm.
The response you get in AI is only as good as your prompt and your ability. I mean, I'm an AI user too, right? So
Yeah.
if I don't get back what I wanted the first time, my ability to reply to AI and say, that's not what I'm looking for. I was looking
Right.
for, and go down in the whatever, or to reflect on my original prompt and say, oh, the way I write it, I know why you went that direction. Let me rewrite it in a way that's more precise. So the number one critical skill in AI is going to be successful, precise writing, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's still sentence level writing, and but yeah, my other answer back to the role of knowledge. I think we've all had moments that we quickly Googled or AI'd ourselves and saw what came back. I used to see what came back in Google. It was stuff I'd written or a time I'd been quoted in an article. But at one point early in AI, when I was just first using, I just asked, who's Karen Vaites? And I saw what came back.
Mhm.
And what came back included the idea that I was participant in a lawsuit in the state of Massachusetts, suing Lucy Calkins and suing Heinemann
Mhm.
over the role that those curricula have played in reading failure, because there was a lawsuit in Massachusetts that ultimately didn't go forward. I had nothing to do with that lawsuit. I'm not in Massachusetts. But somewhere, someone had written down that I was, or speculated that
Mhm.
I was. And so AI thought that to be true. I took a screenshot and I've meant to write about that because it's just a great example of we can all be fed non-truths
Right.
because someone wrote it down somewhere. And my greatest fear is that some of these things that are sort of really current and modern and latest developments, for example, in the curriculum landscape, which I talk about a lot, there are a bunch of new programs and nobody's had time to write up whether they're good or bad.
Mhm.
If you asked AI, what would it find? It wouldn't even, like, it can't listen to our conversations, right?
Right.
It's so we are only at this moment in AI as good as what has been written down. And that's my official reflection point for the day. It
You,
reminds me I need to go finish some blogs.
you actually, it's funny that I saw a meme once, and ChatGPT is like meant to like butter you up, right? So
Right.
if they can pick up that you like it, they're gonna say it's good, right? And so there's a meme I saw once. It's like it said something along the lines: the dumbest person you know right now, ChatGPT is telling them how smart they are. It was like, right, because it is like whatever you're saying, it's making you feel good about
Yep.
your response to that process. So we are both totally in alignment how important this is. I know
Yes.
that one of the research elements of what you're doing is you're seeing where it's happening, that it's really done well. And can you tell me like what is going well? So I'm a school district leader listening to you right now. Where is it going well? And like, if I feel we need to kind of get on a better path, where would you suggest someone start? Like, where would you suggest maybe where they look, what they start with in
Yeah.
their school? How would they go through that process?
So I'm gonna answer that two ways. I'm gonna answer first. I'm gonna tell a state story that I have to tell because I've been
Go.
on a I've been on a soapbox this year that this story that I coined the Southern Surge story of 4 states that have had reading growth that outpaces the rest of the country is a perfect segue to the district level answer to your question. Even though districts aren't going to necessarily enact policies the way that states enact
Can I
policies.
interrupt you for a second? I'm just
Yeah,
curious.
yeah, yeah.
Is the Southern Surge your terminology, or is that
Yep.
okay?
Oh yeah,
Yeah,
I
like
made that up. I made that up.
I love that. I did not know that, but I like always see. I was like, oh, I didn't know that. That's so
Yeah,
cool. Yeah, I always watch you talking about that.
that's my thing. And I'll tell you how that came to be too.
Yeah.
So you've heard my story. I got into this during the Common Core era. And in those early years, Louisiana was this state that was making really early investments. Louisiana said this Common Core thing means a lot. We really get the knowledge part of the importance to comprehension. They had a lot of people who'd read E.D. Hirsch's book. E.D. Hirsch did a lot of really powerful writing about the importance of knowledge to critical thinking and comprehension, but also that we need to give kids all like a certain amount of baseline knowledge so they had what he called cultural literacy. Like, you can't be a literate American debating democracy if you don't have certain foundational knowledge about what a democracy is one example.
Mhm.
So they'd all read E.D. Hirsch, they all really believed in this, and they leaned really hard into making all districts pick knowledge building and structured literacy curriculum more than a decade ago. So I've been watching Louisiana story all this time, and I saw this coming. I visited schools there. And Tennessee followed Louisiana a couple years later. But then Mississippi started emerging because they were doing more teacher training and coaching led work to uh, really get reading foundations right. They focus less on the comprehension and the knowledge part in the beginning. They focus more on we're going to send coaches into schools, state coaches. Starting in 2013, they passed this Literacy Based Promotion Act where they said we're going to send state coaches in 2, 3 days a week to coach you on reading foundations in elementary schools. And if you're in the bottom 20% of schools on performance, we're going to require all teachers to go through a really substantive training about how the brain learns to read. And then we're going to assume that in those bottom 20% of schools, you're all going to pick better curriculum and have better practices. About 5 years into that journey, they realized the schools weren't necessarily changing curriculum fast enough. So then they pushed curriculum change. They've done more since then. But Mississippi also led with third grade retention. They said, in addition to the things I just mentioned, you've got to have screening of all your kids. You're going to screen 3 times a year with a mandated, a state selected screener. You're going to know if your kids are struggling before they hit third grade. But if they go through all that we just described, they're going to have really well prepared teachers, using good curriculum, screened 3 times a year from kindergarten to third. If a kid's not reading by then, we're not passing them on because we know that a struggling reader isn't going to be successful in sixth grade biology if they can't read at third grade reading level. So they instituted third grade retention. And that many people point to as a really key part of this mousetrap. I don't profess to be expert on how the third grade retention added to or didn't add to the mix there. I know some people think that, that can be a contentious topic. And I'll be honest, in the beginning, I didn't believe third grade retention should be happening. I thought I believed a lot of the research that we looked at, 5 or 6 years ago saying, hey, that might hurt kids more than it helps. But I've really come around on this because it's so clear that this is what third grade retention seems to have done in these states is it influences adult behavior. It makes everybody pull out all the stops because nobody wants to tell a child that they're not going to pass on to fourth grade and say that to families. So it seems to the whole system gets effectively aligned around, if we're screening, if we've got this coaching, if we have all these things going right. Mississippi just started successfully getting kids to that proficiency line before third grade at a rate that outpaces the rest of the country. And now they're really starting to show up as a NAEP gainer accordingly. So I've been watching these states for years. And this past NAEP cycle, Louisiana, for the second time in both 2022 and 2024, they were the fastest growing state on reading outcomes. So Louisiana did it a little differently from Mississippi, and Mississippi started surging, 5-6 years ago. They were really showing up as like, wow, this is a major story. Suddenly, Louisiana's a major story too, and you could see Tennessee coming up behind them and Alabama, which carbon copied Mississippi, coming up behind Mississippi. And they were the only 4 states that had clearly had gains on the NAEP since 2019. So I just drew a circle because they were all doing the same things. And I said, frankly, I pitched a bunch of reporters. So I'm like reaching out to New York Times reporters, et cetera, saying, this is a story, you guys should write about this. And no one read about it. So I wrote about it. And then I was like, once I read about it, I'm going to send this to all those same reporters and I'm going to tweet about it and people are going to notice. And then for the longest time, it was like crickets. And I was so annoyed, George, because look at how quickly people drop everything to write a negative story in education.
Right.
Like some teacher somewhere did something in a classroom and people are big mad. You can get the coverage. You can get that on Name Your Channel, right? But here was this massive 4-state positive story and no one would write about it. So I kind of dog with a boned it. And I was like, every day I'm going to tweet about this a different way. And we're going to talk about the curriculum part of the Southern Surge and the training part of the Southern Surge. And I just said, I'm going to keep talking about this till someone joins me. And thank God in the last 2 months, a few reporters have really started showing up to this story and it's getting national attention. So this story is a story people should know because it gets talked about like a policy story, but it's not. It's really a people story. Yes, there's policy involved. I can tell you the legislation. But what they did is they pulled out all the stops to make teachers successful. Better training, better materials, coaching, good screeners that really align a school system around which kids are there and which kids have gaps and where are we sending our intervention resources. Like, it's like, how do you make a school building a team where you're all looking at the same data and you're saying, these are the kindergartners that are there and these are the kindergartners that aren't there. And wow, this teacher has more kindergartners that aren't there yet. She's going to need more reading specialist resource. And hey, wow, we all have the goal. We've got to get kids there by third grade. So let's all start shifting some of our intervention resources from upper grades. Let's get them into the kindergartens and first grades. Like, let's not wait to fail. Let's catch kids early. So good data, good screening data helped school teams recompose how they were applying resources to the overall system. And there's a metaphor there for how you can do school level work. So I'm happy to talk about a favorite district or two and what they've done. But this simple, we're going to pull out all the stops to get every kid reading by third. And that's a gift to our fourth and fifth grade teachers as much as
Right.
anything. That's how it's done.
Well, that whole premise is like a really proactive approach. The idea, I don't know, you said it, I was like, that's such an obvious thing, but it was a really powerful statement. It's like, why would you wait for them to fail? Like,
Mm-hmm.
set them up for success now. That I feel very like justified in saying like you knock down reading and writing, everything else follows that. Like that's me. Not that I was like the first person to say that, but I was just like, why are all these districts focusing on so many other things when you really have to get this thing down? Then you can
Yeah,
focus on the other things,
I
right?
know.
But you have to
Schools
nail
had
that.
one job. If schools had one job, it's literate citizens. And we have the best proof point. My new favorite proof point is that most of these all these southern surge states have math gains. Some of them have really notable math gains, but there was no apparent statewide math program. Like there is a knock-on effect to literacy.
Mhm.
We know that by the third grade, you've got kids starting to read word problems, right? Like you need to give kids reading foundations so they can be successful even in that other core domain area of math. So
I,
I
Listen, I could go all day with you. This is like you're probably my favorite Twitter account. I love
you
your
made my
stuff.
day saying that earlier. You're just making
Seriously,
my
like
day.
it's just actually like I just find your work really fascinating. And the thing that I really appreciate you, and I really encourage people to like check out Karen's work and read some of the stuff because I think it makes a huge impact, is you're so principled on it. You're so focused on like, listen, this has nothing to do with politics. This is just like, how do we help kids, right? How do we help our students? And like, this is what is proven to work. And I feel that it's like interesting because a lot of people, it's like, I talk about innovation. It's like, you're the opposite of me. I'm like, no, you are the foundation to what I'm trying to achieve. Right. But I need that to happen to get to that next level. So Karen, thanks so much for being on the podcast. Everyone, thanks so much for listening. Continue to follow Karen's work. I've been inspired by it. So like, this is like a real treat for me. I'm like really excited to talk to you. So thanks so much for taking time to be on the podcast. And I didn't, now you're like even more famous because I didn't know you coined those terms. Now like you're even cooler than when we first started, which
All
is
I
like
got is
pretty
alliteration.
cool, which is pretty cool at the beginning.
All I got is alliteration. But Southern Surge, please go check it out wherever you are. And thank you very much for taking the time to put a
Yeah.
spotlight on this.
My pleasure. And you will be able to find that in the links down below. So thanks so much, Karen. Thanks everyone for listening. I hope you have a wonderful day. Take care.